Right. Hello, everybody. So I'm Paula, the bee lady, and this is the first of the Elevate Club sessions where you find out a bit more about the members. So I'm Paula Carnell. My business is Creating a Buzz About Health, and I'm the bee lady. So I'm just going to be adding people as we go. And what I'm going to do, I put a little WhatsApp list of different subjects that I can cover about bees. And I'm going to go through the ones that were most popular. And then at the end, if you've got any other questions, or you can write things in the chat, maybe write things in the chat. And then at the end, I'll have a look. So if you have questions that come up from what I'm talking about, because what you might find is I'll answer them as we go. So there has been a lot of questions about honey, and I'm going to address honey. But first of all, I'm going to explain why bees make honey. So even though not everyone was interested in that, it's quite important to understand it. So there's 22,000 species of bees in the world, and only 11 of them make honey. So the two questions are, what do all the other bees do? And then why do the honeybees make honey? So all the other bees are the pollinators. They pollinate our food. And the reason honeybees make honey is because they're the only species of bees that have a number of bees that live through the winter months. All the other bees are either only a hibernating queen. So the bumblebees, you just have a hibernating queen through the winter. And then the solitary bees, it's just larvae. So all bees collect nectar, which is carbohydrate, and pollen, which is protein. But the honeybees, they do this amazing sort of alchemy with the nectar where they dehydrate it. So nectar is about 80% water, and they dehydrate it to less than 20% water so that it will last indefinitely. And then they store it in the hive, and then through the winter months, they will eat that honey. So bees need honey to feed themselves. So that's the first thing to remember. They're not just honey factories for humans. And then they also need the honey to make the beeswax comb. So the wax is made from honey. They secrete wax from their abdomens, and they need 8 kilos of honey to make 1 kilo of wax. And your average beehive needs about 2 kilos of wax. So they're going to need 16 kilos of honey a year just to make enough wax to survive. So they need the wax cells, which they then lay the eggs in. So humans have been taking honey for thousands of years. They started off sort of stealing it from bees that were living wild in the trees. And that's how bees would live, is they would find a cavity in a tree, and that's where they would live, and they'd be quite happy, and they don't need humans. So bees are still wild animals. But humans found that if they captured the bees and put them in a box, it was a lot easier to take the honey. Now, I believe there's a very spiritual connection between bees and humans. The Buddhist monks believe that the highest level of reincarnation is as a bee. And in the Quran, there's a whole chapter called The Bee, where Allah gave his wisdom to the bees to pass on to humans. So bees are just not this sort of farm animal that we want to exploit. There's a much more important reason of why they're around. And so a lot of cultures have believed that honey is medicine. And I also believe that honey is medicine. I'm a trainee medical herbalist. So I believe that different plants have different medicinal properties, and scientists now know that bees will self-medicate. So a colony of bees will go to different plants depending on the medicinal properties of their plant for what the hive needs. So certain plants contain more of certain minerals, and the bees will search for those plants to self-medicate. So that's just mind-blowing in itself. So honey adulteration. One thing you have to understand is that just because it says honey on the jar does not mean it is honey. Honey is the second most adulterated food in the world, and every British supermarket has been repeatedly fined for fraudulently selling honey. So just because it says honey on it does not mean it's honey. And actually you just can't trust that. So the first and third foods that are most adulterated are olive oil, which is quite well known, and rice. And I thought rice was really weird because I thought, how could you adulterate rice? But if you think about it, rice is ground up into a flour, and that's when it can be adulterated. So if you think of all the baby food and all the rice flour products, there's a high chance that it's not actually rice. But honey is always number two. So when you look at a jar of honey, on the back, it might say this is a blend of EU and non-EU honeys, or non-EU and EU countries supply this honey. So what that should say to you is there is a potential for adulteration, because honey is sold in these big drums. So you get beekeepers all around the world, they'll produce honey, put them in the big drums. The big drums are shipped around the world, and obviously not every drum can be tested. So there's a high chance that the honey would be adulterated in the drum. So it could be watered down with just water, it could be mixed with sugar syrup, it could be mixed with rice syrup, or glucose fructose syrup, or corn syrup, you know, particularly from the Americas. And one of the interesting things is that you can imagine honey harvests each year, they depend on the weather, you know, climate, what's flowering, what's growing in all the farmland. So every country in the world, bar one, has good years and bad years. But what happens is in China, they've had a consistently sort of growth of honey. And in America, about 10 or 15 years ago, they had this real battle about honey adulteration. And so they banned Chinese imports of honey. But then what happened was there was this increase in honey being imported from India, Singapore, that has no bees, and Brazil, and Argentina. So what was happening was the Chinese were selling the honey through these other countries, and then it was getting into America that way. So honey adulteration is absolutely rife. And basically, if you're buying it from a supermarket, it can't be honey. So when people say to me, how do you know what honey is? First of all, look at the back of the jar. If it says a blend of EU and non-EU honeys, then just assume it could be adulterated. So honey should say the name of the beekeeper and a single country of origin. Now, the other thing is price. If it's under £5 a jar, whether the jar is an ounce jar, a 50-gram jar, or if it's, you know, a big one, if it's under £5, it just can't be honey. It's not viable. It's just not sustainable. So really think about what you're spending on your honey. So then the next question is Manuka honey, because most people have heard of Manuka honey, and that will be between £25 and £60 for a jar, or even £1,000 for a jar. So people are like, why is Manuka honey so expensive? So Manuka is a flower. It's a type of flower that grows mainly in New Zealand, partly in Australia, and in Cornwall. And when it grows wild in New Zealand, the bees will forage from that and produce Manuka honey. Back in the 1980s, there was a government initiative to find out why or how to economically develop rural communities. And what they found was a lot of these communities had honey, but they weren't selling it all. So the government said, why aren't you selling all the honey? And the people going, well, the tourists don't like the flavor, but we don't mind because we use it as medicine. And the government said, oh, wow, if you're using it as medicine, maybe we should test it and see if it is medicinal, if it has any medicinal properties. And there was a doctor who, name I always forget, but he did these studies on Manuka honey. And what he did was he'd have Petri dishes and he'd have bad bacteria. He'd add the Manuka honey, and there'd be something in the Manuka honey that would have a really good sort of attack mechanism on bacteria. It would be more persistent than other honeys. And so that's called the unique Manuka factor. And the ingredient is called methyl glyoxal. And methyl glyoxal is produced in the plant Manuka through photosynthesis. So this is why it's really important about where the Manuka comes from, because if it grows wild in New Zealand or certain parts of Australia or Cornwall, the photosynthesis reacts in the plant and it produces this methyl glyoxal. And methyl glyoxal has this long persistence of activity. Now, the things you need to realize about Manuka honey is it was the first honey to be proven to be medicinal in the world. There are now 2 other honeys that have been tested to the same pharmaceutical grade tests. One of them is Sidr honey, S-I-D-R, which comes from the Middle East. And the other one is Niaouli, Niaouli, which comes from Madagascar. And both those honeys had governments funding the research and the tests. And that's the key thing to understand, is that to prove a honey is medicinal to the same level as Manuka, you've basically got to have a government's budget. So if I wanted to prove that my dandelion honey was as medicinal as Manuka, which I believe it has medicinal properties, but it will be slightly different to Manuka, I would have to get about 150 samples of dandelion honey from different beekeepers. So that would be a problem in itself. And then I'd need to have the budget of governments to test it to pharmaceutical level. So this is why you only really hear about Manuka honey being medicinal. The reason you don't see much Sidr honey from the Middle East is because much of the Middle East is Islamic, and in the Quran they treat honey as medicine, and so they keep their honey and they have a high value for honey. So Sidr honey would be selling for £30 to £100 a jar, and that's because people treat it as medicine. So you don't see a lot of it over here, because why would they export something when the British are going to want to pay £3 a kilo, which is what supermarkets will pay, and you can't produce honey for that price. And the same with the Madagascar Niaouli honey. It tastes very savory, it's like mushrooms, but the Malagasy people, they use that as medicine. Now, I know some people in this group are very naturally open-minded about medicine and health, and I'll give you an interesting little factoid here. In 2020, I was working as a consultant for a Malagasy honey producer. So they had 350 beekeepers and they're producing lots of honey. And one of the main honeys they produced, they had about 20 different varieties, but one of the main ones was Niaouli. And I was engaged to help market the honey and launch it in the UK. And it was coming from Madagascar to Belgium and then into Europe, into Britain. And what was interesting was when COVID hit, about a month or two in, when there was then talk about vaccines and the big vaccine program and this race to have these vaccines, the Malagasy government knew that they wouldn't be able to afford to buy vaccines for their people. And because the people there are great users of traditional medicine, the Malagasy government put a claim on all the Niaouli honey that was being produced by beekeepers to go into a program to produce a herbal medicine, so mixed with a herb, to protect the Malagasy people against COVID. And this was such exciting news. It went all around the world. Within 24 hours, it was like, you know, Sky News, CNN, everyone's saying, wow, the Malagasy government are investing into this herbal medicine to protect their people. And by hour 25, a major pharmaceutical company had pledged to ensure that the Malagasy people had access to vaccines as long as they stopped their research and their production of a herbal honey and herb medicine. So because I was working with one of the companies, you know, we had like a day or two where it was like, okay, we can't be selling the Niaouli honey because the government wants it because of this. And then by the next day, it was like, okay, it's available again now because the government have been told to stop doing this research. So that's an interesting little honey fact. So when people say to me, oh, you know, I really want a good medicinal honey, so therefore I should have Manuka honey. So the next question is the best honey for you your local honey? Now, most people think, oh, yeah, if I get hay fever, I should have my local honey, or I get Manuka honey, and people will spend between £25, £60 a jar of Manuka honey. Now, Manuka honey is medicinal, but also the other honeys, most other honeys, they work in this way. Honey is hygroscopic, so it absorbs moisture from the environment. So if you have an open wound and you put honey on it, it absorbs the moisture, and bacteria need moisture to thrive. So the honey starves your wound of moisture, and then when the moisture is in contact with the honey, it produces hydrogen peroxide, and that actually attacks the bacteria. So this is how honey works, but you have to have a raw honey. So the other thing, that if you buy a big brand of honey and it's runny, they've probably heated it, sterilized it or pasteurized it to keep it runny, and therefore you won't get the action of the peroxide. So that's how honey works, and different honey varieties have a different length of persistence, and that's what will get tested to see the different properties of different honeys. Now, when it comes to hay fever, there's been 3 studies. Now, I was very ill for a long time, for about 7 years in my 40s, and that's how I got into bees. But before that, I had asthma and hay fever for years, and was a chronic asthmatic, and I used to take local honey. So when I recovered from my condition, which was a genetic condition, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and I was told I'd never walk again, I'd be dead by 50, and there was no treatment. So before that, I had a career as an artist, and then I was bed and wheelchair bound for 7 years with this Ehlers-Danlos. And 2 years into being sick, my husband built me a beehive so I could look out the window here and see the bees in the garden. And the local chap taught me beekeeping. So that's how I got into bees. And then when I recovered using herbal medicine and plant-based minerals, I started speaking for herbal medicine and natural medicine conferences, and also plant-based minerals. And I would often say that I took honey and it helped me with hay fever, and I no longer have honey. And what started happening was I'd get some smart aleck in the audience would go, oh, but the science doesn't back it up. So this really irritated me. So I thought, well, I've got to find this science. So what I found is there's 3 major studies that talk about honey and hay fever. So the first one was an American study. They had 2 groups of people. One group had a sort of fake honey. The other group had a, now it was done in America. So they had a highly filtered honey. So it's basically the honey that you would get in a supermarket, where it gone through such a fine filtering process that it no longer had pollen in. And then they had a fake honey. So it's like a sugar syrup. And what they found, they gave people honey. There was not a regulated amount. It later turned out that not everybody in the groups actually had hay fever. And they found that overall, the reduction in hay fever symptoms was 10%. So this is the science that a lot of people say is rubbish, and it shows that local honey doesn't have any difference. Well, then in the 1990s, the Japanese started studying pollen, and they found that when people took pollen supplements or fresh pollen, it would have a really marked impact on their immune system, and particularly with allergic reactions. So that then prompted a study in Finland, where 25% of the population are allergic to birch tree pollen. So when the birch tree comes into bloom, you have 25% of the population just sneezing, coughing, can't work. So the government funded a proper study because they wanted to know what they could do to help all these people with hay fever. So they had 3 groups of people. One group had a fake honey, so sugar syrup. One group had birch tree honey because they had lots of birch trees in Finland and they could get the honey that was birch tree honey. The third group had not a local honey, but it was a real proper honey, a raw unpasteurized honey. Now, what they also did was they regulated the amount of honey everybody had. So they started off with 1/12 of a teaspoon, which is this much honey. This is how much honey a bee makes in its lifetime. And they started this in November. So they'd have this tiny amount of honey. And then they gradually build it up. So by March or April, they were taking like a teaspoon a day. What they found there was people that had the sugar syrup had a 10% reduction in hay fever, so placebo. The people that had the birch tree honey had a 46% reduction in hay fever symptoms. So you're like, wow, having the local honey really makes difference. But the really interesting thing is the people that had the non-local, non-birch tree honey had a 39% reduction in hay fever. So what this shows is that good honeys will actually help you with any kind of allergic reaction. But what we have to understand in Britain is most people have hay fever from like a grass pollen, and bees don't make honey from grass pollen. So if you're going to take a local honey, it would probably be from rapeseed, or it might be from wild meadow flowers or lime tree, or dandelion. And if your allergen is grass, then that honey is not going to make any difference. The other thing, well, what it will do is do that 39% reduction. So it will boost your immune system, but it isn't based on the fact of like homeopathy that you're taking small samples of the pollen that triggered your hay fever. So honey works in a different way. So when people say, oh, local honey, it's the best thing to take for hay fever, that's the first thing you need to think about. So those of you who've just joined, you can look at the recording and find out that bit. But the other thing to bear in mind is that honey is only as good as where it's come from. And what many people don't understand about beekeeping, and why I'm heretic in the beekeeping world, is beekeeping is the biggest risk for bees. And that is because beekeepers overmanage bees, and they feed bees sugar, and then they take all the honey. They breed bees to not produce propolis, which is the bee's skin. It's their antibacterial, antiviral, anti-everything, antiseptic protection. But also what happens is they're putting chemicals inside the hive. They're using antibiotics and they're using miticides. And these are to protect and treat diseases that bees get. So when you buy a local honey, if your beekeeper is using these chemicals, that's coming through into the honey. And this is what people don't understand. And then if your bees are foraging from crops like apple trees that are being sprayed, or rapeseed that's genetically modified, or sugar beet that is treated with neonicotinoids, that's all coming through in the honey. So this is why if you could get a Madagascan honey, or an organic Spanish honey, or a honey from somewhere else in the world, or a wild New Zealand Manuka honey, then you're going to have a much better quality honey, which would be better for your health. So we really need to start looking at the environment and what is making bees sick. So when, my whole business message is, what if what is killing the bees is also killing us? So you've probably heard this famous quote, which is attributed to Albert Einstein, which is, when the bees die, we've got 4 years left. It actually comes from a guy called Maurice Maeterlinck, who in the 1900s wrote a book called The Life of the Bee, and he studied all the different bees. So in Britain, you've got 275 different species of bees, in the world 22,000. Now, Maurice Maeterlinck says, if the bees die, humanity has got about 4 years left. But it's been interpreted that the bees won't be there to pollinate our food. And therefore, billions of pounds have been spent by governments around the world to develop robotic bees to pollinate our food. But what they're not addressing is why the bees are dying. Now, I sort of think, well, if the way we grow our food is killing the things that pollinate it, what impact is that food having on the people that eat that food? So this is what we really need to address. And if we have 4 years left after the bees die, it's not because we haven't got anything left to pollinate our food. It's because we're a bit bigger and it takes a little bit longer to finish us off than it did the bees. So bees are really integral with any kind of depopulation or management of human health. And this is something that has really troubled me, where I've interviewed bee scientists, and some of the work that's going on with bees is very controversial and quite sinister. So something that happened in Australia in 2022 was a varroa mite was found on some of the government beehives. And varroa mite is the reason that beekeepers use chemicals inside hives. It's this little parasite that sits on the bees. It feeds off their fat bodies, and it weakens them, so they get sick and die. Now, Australia was the only country in the world that didn't have varroa mite, so they could sell their beeswax for a higher price because there was no chemicals used in the hive. And also the beekeepers didn't have to spend all the money on the chemicals. Well, then in 2022, August, the government found 2 hives with varroa mite in. And what they did was they culled those 2 colonies, Nobody thought to say, can we see evidence? Can we see the pictures? Can we see the varroa mite? They culled those 2 hives. Then they did a 10-kilometre radius exclusion zone around those hives in Newcastle, New South Wales, and they culled all the bees. They went to beekeepers, they poured petrol in the hives, and they set light to them, and they just killed all the bees. Then what they did was they motivated children to go into the forest, and if they saw wild bees in trees, they were rewarded for telling government officials that they've seen the wild bees. Beekeepers lost their business. But what was interesting is that part of Australia, New South Wales, they have the almond pollination. Now, in California, they produce 80% of the world's almonds, and it's 1 million acres of almonds growing. So when vegans say to me, oh, beekeepers are cruel and I won't eat honey because it's not good for the bees, I always say, well, do you drink almond milk? Because millions and millions of bees are killed every year when they're transported around America to pollinate the almonds. Now, Australia is building up their almond pollination, and they have to move bees from all over Australia to pollinate the almonds, because the way they grow the almonds is really industrial. So they're spraying the land, it's very toxic. Now, the bee that would pollinate almonds is the blue mason bee. But when you spray crops and you have a monoculture, those bees can't survive. So you then become dependent on the honeybee, which is not as effective at pollinating them. And what the government did was they culled all the beekeepers' bees in that area, but they allowed the huge bee farmers to transport their bees to the almond pollination to pollinate the almonds. Now, I think what they should have done, because we've had 30 years of using chemicals all around the world and we still have varroa, but the bees that have survived varroa, the wild bees and the natural beekeepers who don't use chemicals. So what the Australian government should have done is listen to what we've all learned and thought, okay, we'll stop any movement of bees, we'll stop spraying the almond crops, and we will encourage the native pollinators, so the bumblebees and the mason bees that will pollinate those almonds. And we will allow a death, we'll allow some of our bees to die because they've not adapted to varroa, but what we'll have then is the strong ones will survive and we can breed from them. But instead, they just culled all the bees. And it started off with a 10-kilometre radius, and then it extended to 180 kilometres. And now they're starting to apologise and go, oh my gosh, we've got this wrong and we've just lost all our bees. There's no compensation for the beekeepers. And now there's this massive loss of bees. And they were even aerially spraying fipronil over the towns and villages and the farmland to kill all the insects. Now, the worrying thing is all you need is some woolly in government to say, oh, there's a disease that is on bees, we're going to kill all the bees. And this is what I want everyone to understand, is that we really have to question what experts in government will suddenly think is a way of dealing with disease. You know, you really have to have a hive mind. You really have to have a true democracy before you make decisions on livestock. So bees, even though you think, oh yeah, you know, bees, it's just crazy bee people and they just make a bit of honey, bees really are integral to raising awareness with the general population about what is making people sick and what we can do to be healthy. And this is why my work is very heretic, because within the beekeeping community, I'm saying don't feed sugar, don't use chemicals. And like we have with human health, there is this sort of friction between people that don't use medicinal pharmaceutical products and people that are natural, saying that you're making each other sick. So it all goes down to sort of the mixture between terrain theory or germ theory. So with my studies as a medical herbalist, I'm very much on the terrain theory wavelength, and also with my own health journey and recovery, I'm really understanding that. So coming back to less stressful things and maybe more inspirational things, bees have inspired tech. So when you put something into your computer to search, the search engines are actually inspired by bees, from research on bees. So a chap called Carl von Frisch in the late 1900s or late 1800s to early 1900s, he studied bees, and he found that bees communicate by dancing. And the dancing creates a frequency and a vibration that goes around the wax. It's carried through the wax. The frequency of the wax is the same as the bees at 256 hertz. So the messages are carried through, and the bees pick up the messages from their feet, which are then translated into images. So there's this lovely quote that when a bee sees food, it dances more. And what the bee will do is it will come back to the hive and it will do a dance which gives the exact location of where the food is. So what flowers are flowering, how much nectar they produce, how much time that nectar will be available for, and how many bees it will need to collect it, and how many bees will be needing to stay in the hive to receive this great delivery if bees are going out. Now, it's all directed by the sun, and also the plants emit different electrical frequencies depending on what information they want the bees to have. So when a plant is secreting nectar, it might be because it's a certain temperature, it's in the right soil, it's the right time of day. And it emits an electrical field that the bees pick up. So it's like a song. So the bees are like pulled like magnets to these flowers. Now, so this exchange of information and sharing of the information amongst the hive is a really efficient way of making sure you maximize the resources. And that's what they use to use search engines. It's called the bee algorithm. And it's how computers find the maximum amount of information in the shortest space of time that has the most relevance for what words you've put in. So it's just amazing. And also when you do facial recognition, that has all evolved from learning how bees recognize people. So when a bee looks at you, it will measure the distance between your eyes and your mouth and your chin and your ears. And so bees recognize people. And this is just mind-blowing, because it just shows why, as a beekeeper, you can develop a special relationship with your bees. But what I love is this connection with business, because bees also have a corporate memory. So bees only live 6 weeks. So if I go and look at my hive now and a bee comes out and it sort of zigzags around, it goes, oh, that's Paula, because her eyes are there and her mouth's there and her ears are over there. It will go back to the hive and it will share the information of who Paula is. And that information is transported through frequency and vibration through all the wax, and the bees have a corporate memory. So this means when that bee dies, the next bee that's born next month or in 3 months' time or 6 months' time or 6 years' time has that knowledge of what Paula looks like. And this is the relevance of business, because if you employ a team and you have one of your team who's meant to do perhaps customer relations, and they find out that one of your customers likes their coffee with cream and 2 sugars, if that member of staff leaves and hasn't shared that information, your business is then at a disadvantage when it comes to customer relations. And so when you build a business, you really want to develop the corporate memory, so that any information that you've paid your staff to gain and learn and develop, you want it to belong to the business. So you want these SOPs. Yeah. So you've got to have the SOPs to really be able to grow your business. And this is what you can learn from bees, is that they were the original SOP creators. So they have a corporate memory. So a healthy colony of bees are able to communicate. Now, all this communication between plants and bees is on frequency and vibration. But what humans have done is we've upset all this natural communication with our electricity, our Wi-Fi, broadband, 5G, all these things. And it's because man-made electricity pulses. So natural waves are just a steady flow. So when a tree or a flower is calling out the bees, it just sends out this straight wave. And think of it like a note, like a song. It's like a frequency of like, it goes out. The bees hear it and they go, oh, that's the snowdrops telling us they've got nectar today. So the bee goes, oh, okay. And the bee has a positive electrical charge when it's flying, and the flower has a negative charge, so they're pulled like a magnet. When the bee drinks the nectar, it changes the polarity of the flower, and then the next bee knows that that flower doesn't have any nectar left. So it's all really good. But you have this electrical field going out, and if in between the flower and the beehive you've got an electrical wire or you've got Wi-Fi, our electricity pulses. So it's almost like a pair of scissors coming up and snipping that field. So what happens is the bee can hear the song, it starts flying, and then somebody snipped that connection, and it's like, oh, where was I going? Or maybe they get to the flower and they turn around and they want to go back again to the vibration of the hive, but there's too many snips, too many pulses of man-made electricity, and so they can't get back to the hive. And this is one of the things that is killing bees, is just the smog of EMF radiation. So one of the things I do is I line my hives with shungite. So I mix up a shungite powder and propolis, and I paint the inside of the hives. So even when the bees are outside of the hive and they're affected by all the EMF radiation, they can go back to the hive and they can sleep. They're actually in a sort of a Faraday cage, so their body can reheal, and they can fix all the cells. So it really makes a difference for the bees. So just how it affects bees, it's affecting us too. And now there's more and more evidence about human frequency and energy medicine and the importance of that, and therefore the importance of us protecting ourselves from all this EMF smog that is upsetting people. So I've gone through those. Let me just check what else. So yeah, what's killing the bees? I'm just going to say, does the queen rule the hive, or is it a true democracy? This is, I line my hive with shungite. So shungite is amazing stuff. Have you all heard of shungite? Just nod if you have. Yeah. Okay, it comes from Russia and it predates planet Earth. So it must have been a meteorite that landed, and it contains 99% carbon, and the last 1% has every element known to mankind. And it's a physical barrier to EMF radiation. And so you can buy it in rocks, or you can buy it in a ground up powder. So what I do in my hives is I get the powder, I mix it with propolis, which is resin the bees collect from trees and mix with pollen. And then I paint it on the inside of hives so they have a thin layer. But what I'll also do is put a shungite rock in the hive so the bees can just sit on it, because the frequency of that shungite emanates out. So it's quite amazing. So inside the hive, you've got one queen, 49,000 female worker bees, and about 100 to 200 male bees. And that will be from April till October. End of the year, they kick out all the male bees. They kill them because they're surplus to requirements. But the queen bee should live 2 to 7 years, and the worker bees live 6 weeks. 3 weeks inside the hive, 3 weeks out. And what I love is every decision that a bee makes is for the good of the species, not even that colony. So when a bee finds more food, it will dance more to share that knowledge, so then that can be passed down. So the colony then, through generations, they know where all the good trees are, where all the right flowers are in that environment. Now, when the queen lays eggs, the worker bees all make cells, and they make the wax cells from the honey, and they eat the honey, and then they exude these little wax discs from their abdomen, which then the other bees, they all hold hands and they chew them and they make them into these hexagons. But they'll make different size cells. So a small cell will then, when an egg's laid in it, it will then become a female bee, and a large cell will become a male bee. And what's argued much about beekeepers and bee scientists is how the bee becomes male or female. So the queen, when she hatches and she's mature, she'll leave the hive, and on the wing she'll fly off to a drone congregation area where all the male bees hang out, like a male pub for bees. And she'll fly out there and she'll mate with between 15 and 48 male bees, and all the sperm she'll collect in her spermatheca. She'll store it in a spermatheca, and it will last all her life. So she comes back to the hive, and when she lays an egg, when she lowers her abdomen into a small cell, Her abdomen is compressed, which squeezes the spermatheca and releases sperm, fertilizing the egg, so then it becomes a female bee. If it's a bigger cell, her abdomen isn't compressed, so the egg isn't fertilized, and then it becomes a male bee. But the argument is, does the queen fertilize the egg before she lays it, or is it because of the compression? So scientists got a queen bee on a plain sheet of paper and watched her lay eggs, and then saw whether the eggs were male or female. And the thing was, she laid male and female eggs, so fertilized and unfertilized eggs. But then the argument is, the queen's role is for the colony to survive. And if they don't have male bees, the bees would die out. So maybe she's adapted to her environment. So we just don't know. But what I love is when you're managing bees, they will make different wax comb so that they will always have the right balance of bees. Now, they'll make a lot of male bees in the spring, so that when queens hatch, there's plenty of males for her to mate with. She won't mate with males from her own hive, but the males will all meet up at this place. And what beekeepers will do is cull the male bees, because they don't want lots of male bees for all kinds of reasons, for disease and for mating, for swarming. So they'll take out the frames of male bees and kill them all. But the bees will then make more and more big cells to try and get back the male bees. So it's not like they've tried once and then they give up. They always try and do what they want to do. So I love this democracy. And when the bees swarm and find a new home, they won't move into a new hive until they all agree that it's the right place to go. So it's not run by a queen going, this is where we're going to go. It's run by a democracy. And the last thing I'm going to say, which I think is so important for businesses, and I've really noticed this with some of my clients, and particularly as the companies get bigger. And I myself, I'm a founder and I've got a team. And as I get busier, I'm away from my team more often. Now, inside a beehive, you have a queen, and the pheromones that the queen exudes keep the hive happy, healthy, and calm. And if you remove the queen, the bees go into a bit of chaos and they go into a bit of panic, and they're like, oh shit, what's going on? And then they try and rear a new queen. Now, if you are running a business and you're the founder and you're not regularly in the environment of your team, the same can happen with your business. And if you start having a business growing and the queen is not touching in some way all the different staff, you'll find chaos. You'll find that there is not that there isn't that uniform, that confidence or that happiness that the business is running. So when I work with organizations and help them team build, it's really important that each department has its queen, or you have the general queen. And you'll find with most companies, just a tiny bit of interaction with the founder or with the queen will be enough to motivate them for a long time. Whereas if they've got a lower down manager, chaos ensues, because they're not quite sure what the values are, what the resonance is of the hive. So so have a think. So queens in business is really important. So I think I've answered all the questions. I'll have a quick look through. Oh, thank you. Yeah, shungite on phones, it's brilliant. That's why we have it. Yeah. Same with ingredients, food, terrain theory. Yay. It's all coming out now. It's lovely. I've been a crazy woman for years, and now finally the world is catching up. All right, Gary, you've raised a hand, so unmute yourself and speak away.
Hi, Paula. Very interesting chat. Sorry.
Not chat, a sort of
No, it was actually incredibly interesting, and the last part as well is that you linked it to business. I found fascinating. I always hear like people talk about different kinds of societies, and I would say I'm more on the capitalist side. Would you say that from what you've learned about bees, you could actually, there's definitely stuff we can learn as humans about how to adopt some of the ways that they actually live and exist, but what you just said at the end there, would that be like the true example of what a socialist society could be if it actually was, effectual, and it it wasn't overtaken, where the principle is good, but in practice, from what I've seen, it's never actually worked fully, which is why people on the, more capitalist side always sort of argue what we've got isn't great in a lot of respects. However, we don't really have a model which is better right now, and everything's been tried before hasn't really worked. But I think from what you said about the obese society, that could be something to adopt potentially.
Oh, definitely. And it is challenging. I mean, I've always had my own business, so I'm definitely a capitalist and selfish. I run a business. I do feel I'm not motivated by profit. Perhaps I should be, but I'm motivated by doing what I feel has to be done. It's, God's work or my work. And at the moment, my work is to speak for the bees. But the thing to remember is bees have evolved over 150 million years. So they're a lot further down the evolution roll than us, which is, so boys, you're all right for the moment. We're not going to be kicking you all out in the autumn. But I think the problem we have is we judge hives with a human perspective, and many humans are not ready yet to look at the world from a bee's perspective. So just the simple things like feeding bees sugar, when I started challenging beekeepers about this, they were like, well, everyone feeds bees sugar, and if we don't feed them, then they're going to die. But they're taking too much honey. And I started thinking, well, because I was a mum, and because when I learned this, I was ill, I knew that if I ate sugar, I had more inflammation, more sickness, more pain. And I thought, crikey, if I fed my boys white sugar from August to April, they wouldn't be healthy. So I started looking at human life from a bee's perspective, and then looking at the bees, sort of translating, how about if we lived like them as humans? But I'm not ready to be completely selfless. And I used to love watching Star Trek and the Borg, where they would land on a planet and they would assimilate and then have this corporate memory. They would absorb all this information about this alien species and take it back for the betterness of the whole, which would be the Borg. And to me, that was just horrific, because I love being an individual. I love having that freedom of choice. And something, a lot of my clients, where they're buying estates and they're doing regenerative agriculture and they're doing things that are inspired by bees, and it's much more natural. But the last step for me is that community living. And there's something called the Anastasia movement, which is like a Russian thing of where people live in communities, but they all have their own 4 acres. And I can I get that. I like fences, But I think as I get older and as I'm more comfortable and satisfied with what I've achieved in life, I can then relate to that bee socialism a lot better. But I don't think humanity is ready for that yet, because not enough humans are selfless, and we've got too much fear. We don't have that trust that we would be really looked after by everyone else. And the other challenging thing was that when I was ill, I was in a wheelchair, I was bedbound for 7 years. I was told I'd never walk again. Now, if I was that ill as a bee, the bees would kick me out of the hive because I would not be of benefit to the bees. But as a human, I had to learn that I had benefit and I could contribute to society, even though I was bedbound and couldn't work and couldn't really be a mum, couldn't really be a wife. But I had to learn that just being had value. And this is where we have to think, it's not about being like bees or being like buffaloes or tigers, or it's about what is being human all about, and what can we learn from rhinoceroses and bees and buffaloes, and how can we protect the world. So if you think of what is the role of bees, and I believe the role of bees is to help heal and educate humanity. So if we don't eat their honey, we're not taking the medicine. If we don't listen to bees, we're not learning from the bees. And I think our role as humans, and I talk about this in my TEDx talk, it's about being the guardians of nature and protecting the environment so the bees have enough flowers to feed them, so they have a surplus of nectar to then give us medicine. And so I think everything is interconnected, and the bees are here to teach us about the connection of everything and how bees actually connect everything, and how by studying the bee and observing the bee, you can learn about what is our role as humanity within nature. We're not on top of it or outside of it. We are part of nature. And that's the big lesson I've had. So I'm not ready to live in a hive, you know, or even in a community. I mean, I'm loving the fact our kids have left home and it's just me and my husband. And I love the fact we've got a big enough house that we don't have to be in the same room all the time. So yeah, I think it's, as humans, we're always looking for that one magic pill or that quick fix or that answer. But the answer is within each of us, that then we have to discuss. And that's the other thing with AI, is there's been these studies about how bees make a swarm decision. So you'll have 49,000 bees and together they will come up with a decision. Now, I find this challenging because I've always had my own business and I've always felt that if you have more than 6 people on a committee, you'll never get a decision made. But science and studies have proven that the more people who are involved in a decision, the better the decision outcome is for humanity as a whole. And that I find really, really challenging because, you know, I'm impatient. I think I know what's right. I trust my intuition. And so to have to wait for the rest of humanity to agree with me, it's just, I'm not ready for that. So I think, you know, bees are prompting conversation, and that's what we need to embrace. But yeah, sorry, a long-winded answer, but yeah.
No, that was great. Thank you very much.
Yes, health of the whole tribe. So yeah, me being ill, I feel I was ill, even though it's a genetic condition. It was a result, or it was exacerbated by the condition of my environment, which we're all in. So if we protect the environment for the bees would be healthy and they wouldn't have to kick out disabled and diseased ones. And the same with humans. If we could really look after all of our environment, you'd have less people being sick.
I meant it in the way that if everyone makes a decision, it has to do with the health of like everyone making that decision needs to be healthy and on point in order to make a decision for the correct answer versus like if everyone's sick, then a group decision isn't going to be the ideal outcome. Is what I was thinking of it as.
Yeah. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, you know, really, really mind-blowing. And something that troubles me, because I really want to have a debate about this, is there's scientists who've been studying the behavior of bees. Bees have been studied with their behavior for 4,000 years. They're the most researched being. And only in the last 10 years, bees are exhibiting unsocial behavior. You are now having bees within a hive who are the equivalent of standing with their backs to the rest of the colony, sort of this. And bees who are exposed to a toxic environment, their lifespan is shortened by 50%, and they're shaking and they're unable to rest. So a healthy colony of bees that's not exposed to a toxic environment spend the majority of their time resting. So you look at humanity and how huge proportions of the population are unable to rest. And so you look at our environment, and that I find really, really mind-blowing. You know, and it's, you can't even, you know, it's just shocking. So yeah. So does anybody want to know anything else? Because I'm 3 minutes off an hour, so it's been a stampede of a swarm of bee knowledge, bee wisdom. I'm just having a quick look through. If there's anything else? Wow, it's crazy.
Just a quick one. Do you have any recommendations for, like, you know, the true honey and stuff like that, so we're not going for the super rubbish?
If it's under £5 a jar, it's probably not honey, no matter what size it is. If it says on the back a blend of EU and non-EU honeys, it has a high potential for adulteration. Honey is the second most adulterated food, and every single supermarket in Britain has been repeatedly fined for fraudulently selling honey. So if you want really good honey, You can buy it from me. I have different honey producers that I supply. I can also recommend honeys. So wherever you are, I can tell you which beekeepers. But also it goes back to what I talked about earlier on, is that a lot of beekeepers in Britain, they put chemicals in the hive, they use antibiotics on their bees, and they feed them sugar. So that is going to come through in the honey. So you've got different layers of quality honey. You cannot get a British organic honey because bees fly in a 3-mile radius around the hives. And there's not an area that size in Britain where the bees would not be exposed to chemical agriculture, which means
I'm just wondering, because like honey is always regarded being a superfood, and I imagine there's a lot of people out there going, I'm eating my superfood, I'm eating my fructose bloody rubbish. And I'm just wondering if there was I don't know if you do this for your site, but do you advertise it as like a a true superfood? Do you highlight the components of it? So say for example, I've tried different things from shilajit to lion's mane, a few other things. And I know that honey is often repeated as being like a superfood, but I've never seen it actually illustrated in terms of why, other than the medicinal benefits to like, helping with flu or something like that. They said, I think one of them is mix honey with cut up onion. It was like a remedy that someone told me.
Yeah, I mean, honey's been used as a preservative, for 4,000 years. So with ginger, with with onions, with garlic, just to preserve it. So it is good. And bodies, human bodies were preserved in honey as well. Through my studies with herbal medicine, unfortunately, you've got to be so careful about making any claims, and you just can't. So we sell honey as a food, and that's what we do. So with propolis spray is mind-blowing. There's about 10,000 studies showing all the medicinal properties of propolis. So if you have a propolis throat spray, if you get a tickly throat, it just knocks it for six. It's just amazing. But you can't make any medical claims. So all you can do is say, well, this is what propolis does in the hive. This is why the bees take honey. The Quran says honey is medicine. Do your own research. I say really trust your intuition and look for single variety honeys that call to you. So there isn't one honey that's going to be the honey for you for the rest of your life. You might feel you want a whole oak honey because it is sort of calling to you, but then another time you might find lavender honey is more for you. You might want a Spanish honey, you might want a Middle Eastern one, you might want a Somerset one, it all depends. But in Britain, we don't produce enough honey to have year-round honey for the UK, because people are buying and eating so much sugar syrup that's addictive, and they have to eat more of it. So it's a right mess with honey. But go and have a look at my website. It's just paulacarnell.com. And I have honeys, and I have my own Castle Carey honey is seasonal. So I don't have a lot of it because most of it goes for my bees. And then when I have it, it's on the website. And then I buy in from a Spanish beekeeper called Antonio. There's a company called Nicte. I have some of their honeys, but I don't think they're on my website, but in my shop I have them. But you can look them up. It's Nikte.com, and they are honeys from the Yucatan in Mexico. Really pure, really good honeys, but they import them through Spain into the UK, and they're London based. And then I know, I've got beekeeper friends around the UK, so wherever you are, I can say that's a good beekeeper, or this is a good one. There's Manchester Honey Company, who are amazing because they don't feed their bees any sugar, they don't use any chemicals in the hives, so they're really good. And they've got a website. So and I do online courses if you want to keep bees. I work as a consultant, but I'm just about to go off to a desert island for a year to set up a bee project and work with an Islamic community. And I've set up a film company, so I'm really excited that the government have now just done 40% tax relief on investment in films. So that's really exciting. So that's what I do. But I love speaking. I love speaking about bees, and that's my mission, is to have a bigger platform. And that's why I've set up a film company, because there's so much about bees that the world needs to know, and I feel that's my role. That's what I have to do. Okay.
It's amazing. I don't want to have a coughing fit because I want to distribute this recording everywhere. So I'm going to keep my words small. Paula, that was incredible. I am obsessed. I'm on your website now, multitasking. And because my throat is burning at the moment, I'm going to get your honey as soon as I can.
Oh, yeah.
I wish I'd known earlier, but it's fine. Better late than never.
Oh, I wish I'd
Thank
known. I
you.
would have sent you a jar.
No, I know. I never get sick, so I was a bit like, oh, that was
Oh.
absolutely outstanding. And we've got another got a Dark Matters meeting now, but can I distribute this everywhere? Because I think people
can.
need to know this. It's so important.
They do. Do you know, I really want to be on Ellie's podcast because I just got to share it out. And
it's
you know,
glorious.
that's why I joined Elevate.
I'll
basically.
send it. I'll send it to her. I promise I will send it. I will send this to her. This is just mind-blowing. And I've got so many things to say, but this is probably not the best day to say it. But I clearly need your honey, so I'm going to go and get some.
Oh, brilliant. Lovely. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
I will share. I don't know quite what I'll do. I'll upload it somewhere. I'll upload it in the Facebook if I can, or if not, I'll send you the link.
Well, we can put it into YouTube somewhere another. We can figure it out, Paula. So don't worry. We can trim it. We can trim off my nonsense at the end and have it where you finished. And yeah, we'll sort it out. No worries.
All right. All right. Lots of love, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paula.
Thank you,
It's been an
Paula.
absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Gorgeous.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.